We might see in this a Chinese worldview, but not really a Chinese world order. There was much less of a unified system than once was thought. The tribute system, of course, existed. That's undeniable. But the practice of foreign relations was much more complicated and varied than the theory of the tribute system would lead us to believe. If we look back into early imperial history, for example, Gaozu of the Han in 192 BC achieved peace with our old friends the Xiongnu by a kind of a reverse tribute, by offering a Chinese princess and annual gifts of grain and silk. The Tang did much the same, sending an ambassador to the Uyghurs to enlist their support against the Anlushan rebellion, paying them off with the emperor's daughter and 20,000 rolls of silk annually. It wasn't just tributaries who paid tribute. Necessity gave way to cultural compromise in these and in many other cases. In short, whatever the theory about China being central culturally, the practice of late imperial relations with foreigners was to deal with different people in different ways. And when the Qing came to power, it had to interact with people from all three of these zones. In the first zone, the Sinic or Chinese cultural zone, which was rich in historical precedents, expectations were more or less clear on all sides. And what the Qing sought most in that zone was respect. The second realm also had a rich history of China and Inner Asia in particular, more often than not a history of failure from a Chinese point of view. But here the Qing, itself a non-Chinese dynasty, had a fresh approach and a rather successful approach. But what it sought at the end of the day, like its predecessors from the Inner Asian frontier, was peace. The third realm is more complicated. It would call for an entirely new set of foreign relations, this time between the maritime West and the Qing ruling on Chinese territory, for which neither side had any relevant experience. The Qing, like the Ming before it, would first try to place the small group of Western traders on China's coast into the tributary category, even though that didn't fit it well at all. And at the same time, those Westerners from Europe would periodically seek what we would now call formal diplomatic relations with the Qing on the basis of equality, which to the Qing was a concept at once incomprehensible and insulting. However flexible it was in practice, there simply was no vocabulary in the Qing diplomatic lexicon for those kind of ideas. If the Qing sought respect from Vietnam and peace from Xinjiang, what it really hoped for from the small numbers of Western merchants and missionaries that gathered to trade in Macau and then later South China, Canton, was that they simply wouldn't be too much of a bother and sooner or later would go home. Now, in understanding why the West was a truly peripheral, in every sense, concern to the Qing compared to the Sinic or Inner Asian zones, we have to remember that Western merchants first came to China not to trade directly between China and Europe, but rather to serve as carriers of Asian trading routes. Macau, that little spit of land settled by the Portuguese in 1557, was used as an exchange port on an Asian trading route between Canton and Japan. The Dutch would also join the act, trading along China's coast from Taiwan. But as almost everywhere else, these nations would be eventually supplanted by Great Britain. In 1770, the Qing finally sought to make a system that would incorporate these newcomers, a system we now know as the Canton system. This system restricted all European trade with the empire to Canton, Guangzhou, which made it easier to license, easier to manage, and all legal trade could be conducted through a Chinese monopoly, a monopoly of approved Chinese merchants known as the Kohong. The solution seemed simple and fair. All Europeans would be treated alike. And it had the great value of permitting commerce not between nations and states, but between different commercial monopolies, the Kohong on the Chinese side, the East India Company in particular on the British side. And as long as that lasted, both sides could avoid dealing with questions of diplomatic and cultural equality that were increasingly taken for granted in Europe. And both sides could avoid the idea that Westerners were formally challenging the official myths of Chinese foreign relations.